Last time we started looking at expanding a DFD to several DFDs. In fact, we started with a hostel mass management system, which is our running example. So, we said billing system, among that, in that mass management system, billing system is an important part. The billing system essentially takes the menu from the mess manager based on, and he gives the items used in that menu, and based on that the update daily rate goes to the mess secretary, who kind of knows what it is going to cost, and at the end of the month the payments will be received from the students for the bills which are sent, and also the bills will have itemization, as we said, and expenses are noted in the in a file, and student information plus bills is in another file, and this is the general structure with which it started. And next we went to from there we expanded that billing system into several parts. There is in other words, I said, in all complex examples the basic rule is to divide and conquer. So, for dividing and conquering, you split up a very basic high level DFD or high level data flow diagram into a set of connected diagrams, where each one can be separately looked at, and each one the programs or processes can be written. So, that is the whole idea of really breaking down. In fact, technically it is called leveling a DFD. That is breaking out a single DFD into subcomponents, where each component belongs to one. In other words, the billing system itself consists of a number of parts. One is calculating students' bills. Last time there is an error in that students square, and in fact it is written as if I remember right mess manager or so. Okay, so we have changed it, and you just note it actually because the bills go to the student, not to the mess manager, and the payments are received from the students. So, the billing system can be divided into calculating students' bills. In fact, we finding the number of meals based on which the daily rate can be calculated, okay, because the daily rate it depends upon the number of meals to cook and also the menu. Okay, so the expenses data is put from the after the daily rate is calculated, total expenses is put on a separate file, and there is an item rate which is used in order to calculate the daily rate, because each item has got certain cost, and you got to really find out the billing based on that cost. And similarly, there is a separate part talking about reconciling payments. In other words, when the payments are received from the students, they got to be checked against the bill which is sent, and that is called reconciling. And if there is a payment is underpayment or overpayment, then of course there should be an exception report or a notice which should be issued to the student saying that your bill is not properly paid, and if it is unpaid bill for a long pending period, we said that it will be sent to the chief warden for taking action. Okay. So, the important point I really want to make is that the billing system has itself been divided into number of subparts as a part of division. So, question of how to divide it logically depends on the problem, okay, and is also to some extent arbitrary. It is not that there is a specific way you can break down. You really have to think logically, saying that something which is got to billing has to have something to do with number of meals cooked. You have to, it's got something to do with the rates of items and daily rates and it has got something to do with the fact that the daily rates in effect also are given to the based on that only the students' bills are prepared, and reconciling parts is very important, because there is one little part which I could have added, namely the student mess secretary, who is supposed to give the actual menu for the 2 days ahead of time, so that the actual items can be bought ahead of time from the vendors. Okay. And this I have not put in this primarily because it is cluttering it up. I mean, there is not enough space in this PPT to be able to put that and clutter up the whole thing. So I thought I will mention it and not just clutter up the thing. You can put it yourself. In other words, there got to be some kind of an input to come from the student mess committee manager or student mess committee secretary who decides on the menus and so on, and he should be able to give the items to be used 2 days ahead of time to the calculate daily rate, because only based on the item cost the daily rate can be calculated. And of course, the mess manager also has to kind of be told about what items to the number of meals to be cooked based on the number of students and also based on the menu. Okay. And so, in other words, the calculate daily rate in fact is the most complex of the whole set of processes, because it has got number of parts to do. I could have in fact divided up the calculate daily rate into multiple parts. One is to find out the total number of items to be used on any given day, and then another module which essentially says, having calculated, finding out the total number of items to be used on any given day for based on the menu, calculate the daily rate, which can be which uses this. In other words, the point I am trying to make is the number of the processes or circles into which you want to divide is depends upon your convenience. I mean, there is something like if you divide into too many parts, then also it is each process will become a 3-line process. It's just like the same rule in programming languages. When you program, you don't want to make functions just 2 lines or 3 lines. Functions must do something substantial. Okay, that is the reason I have used it this way. But you could try it out. In other words, there is nothing sacred in this particular division of the billing DFD into multiple parts. Okay. Now let us look at the stores issue. Stores issue is the other part which we see. Actually, like it came from the mess management system. Mess management system was a single high level chart. No, and then then we divided it up into multiple parts. So the this particular one now is the stores issue and control system. That is, billing system is one part. Stores, in other words, we gave a number 1 to that billing system. We give a number 2 to the stores issue and control system. Stores issue and control systems, again, based on the issue has got to be done by the mess manager to the cooks and so on, and orders also have to be placed. So the stores issue and control system primarily looks at the situation in terms of the ordering to be done at the appropriate time, vendor payments to be made, and the orders are placed and all that. In other words, there are number of things which it does, and again, because there is I am giving a high level part now, that is 2 can be broken up into number of sub parts, and each sub part will have a role to play. Like for instance, we go to the next one, 2 itself becomes 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, which are all the parts of the system, and so in terms of control, we had to have control of, in other words, stores issue and management system must have inventory, update and low stock warning, so that whenever the stock becomes low, it can be ordered in time. Otherwise, as I pointed out, there are current system, they found that they were not able to predict what is to be used, and with the result that the ordering was in trickles, and that added to the cost. Whereas we order in bulk and the delivery has to be done a few times rather than too often, then I think the total cost will go down. So, that is the inventory update and stock low stock warning system is one part, and creating order to the vendors is another function which has got to be done, and calculates item needed, which is again, unless we know the items needed, you cannot really check the item availability. In other words, if the mess secretary gives a certain menu for which items are not available, then you have to really tell, either order it immediately if it is essential, or there has got to be a feedback with the mess secretary saying that this particular item is not available and would you like to change the menu. And so, the point is the calculated items needed based on whatever menu is given, and based on the availability of that you decide whether to do it or not. In other words, each one is again a process, or you might say a function. Okay. And so, the high level DFD, which was the previous one, namely the stores issue and control system, has been split up into a lower level DFD. This is what I said is leveling. Okay. So, the leveling is what is being done, and let us go back to the rules for leveling. In other words, I have just given you examples of leveling. See, in other words, the reason why I am doing it is you have to fix your ideas, and it is always good to start with a particular example, and starting with a particular example you generalize it, and after generalize it you come back and look at particular example to see if the generalization works or not, and that is the way in which I have actually presented in the web and in the book and so on. But in a lecture I thought I would really go back and forth and be able to tell you that where do the leveling rules arise. I mean, is it arbitrary, but there is a logic behind all these rules, and the logic has got to be explained, and when you actually do a leveling yourself, you have to check whether you have followed the leveling rules and you are not really contravened any of the rules which are which have been put down. One is the process P is expanded, the process at the next level are labeled P.1, P.2 and so on. In other words, I said 1.1, 1.2, 2.1, 2.2 and so on. The whole idea is nothing but labeling to kind of know that it belongs to starting with a high level number 2, it goes to lower levels. All data flows entering the first one, that is the high level, should also enter the lower levels. In other words, unless they are there, actually you are breaking up a single one into multiple ones. Okay. Single one is based on certain data input, and the data input has to be preserved. You cannot you cannot have a system with new data coming in which is not put in the original, unless you made a mistake in the original. So, sometimes what happens is that when you do the leveling and you start expanding it, you find suddenly that you made an error in the original. So, you go back to the original and change it there, but you make sure that at the end of the game, after you level, whatever data entered the top level should also enter the lower level. In other words, expanded level. Okay. The expanded DFD may have data stores, that is, new data stores can be created. In fact, if you had observed keenly, we had created certain new files in the in 2.1, 2.2, 2.3 and so on, which are over and above what is there in 2. I would like you to kind of go back and look at the 2 itself, which is I think this is 2, and here you had 1, 2 files, 3 files, and here I have 1 file, 2 file, 3 files, 4 files. Okay, so in fact I have created files. Okay, so so it may have data stores, which I have shown in the in the expanded DFD. We have shown that new files are there. That is not wrong, and because the expansion, you would like to be able to kind of have the same data split up into multiple files for convenience. That is effectively what we have done. For convenience, and particularly for the process, when you write the process, the data only required by that process only is to report in the file. And if the file has got all kinds of cluttered information, it may not be necessary. In other words, it may not be essential, but and you are wasting actually space. Because when you come to database management systems, we will look at some of the issues in terms of how to kind of break up a very large database into parts which are all using certain rules and certain methods. We have to make sure that the after we make some alterations in the database management system, we have so-called relations in that case, and one larger relation can be split up into other relations. So we will look into that at a later time, but at this time I am really looking at not in detail of implementation. So only when you get to implementation, you have to worry about database management system, the kind of database you are going to use and all that. This is a higher level. Just to tell you might say, to make sure that this data is available in files, and to make sure for yourself that later on when you give it to a programmer, he will be able to appropriately interpret it and create it into a proper database management system. No new external entity can appear in the expanded DFT. In other words, whatever entities are there, what I mean by external entities, in our case it was vendors, it was mess secretary, mess manager, student, all these are external entities. So suddenly you can't bring in a new external entity into a lower level, because all the generation of data is all done by the external entities. Okay, external entities are the generators of data as well as consumers of data. You can't bring in a new generator and new consumer in a expanded DFD which was not there in the original. That means you made a mistake in the original. So you have to go back and say, maybe I should add more external entities to the top level DFD, and make sure that because of that I have kind of put in these things. Otherwise it should not be there. Also, to keep the number of processes at each level less than 7. In other words, the 7 is something which is again a magic number. The reason why you try to kind of, when you break up something into smaller parts, if you break it up into too many smaller parts, you will not be able to understand the each of them and their interrelationships at all very logically. There is a psychological rule which says there is a magic number 7 plus or minus 2. That psychological experiment says that people in general have a certain capacity to remember. Like for instance, telephone numbers, they have a certain capacity. Average person, there are people who remember 100 digits and so on and so forth. But by and large, people have a certain capacity to kind of visualize in one visualization a certain number of parts. If the number of in the visualization, if the number of parts become too many, then the visualization loses its meaning. Okay. So for visualization, you have to keep your numbers reasonable. I mean, it should not be 2 or 3. It could be 4 or 5. And I use only 3 or 4 for the simple reason that my screen size is limited. Okay, and I cannot go on putting too many of them in my screen. Okay, but it is if if you feel that you want to expand this further, you could do it yourself, which you can try as an exercise. Okay. So this is a kind of leveling rules, and using the leveling rules I am showing a leveling example, an abstract example, not an example which is particular. I said from particular you go to general, that is what I said. So from particular we have already looked at, so we are now going to general. So general effectively says that you have external entity A. In this case, to simplify matters and to fit it in my screen, I assume only 2 external entities. There is one which is feeding the input, one which is feeding the output at the top level process. Okay, and it could be many more, but I said just for my convenience of showing. And then top level process is divided into number of smaller processes 1, 2, 3, 4. Each one is certain new file, but external entities you see has remained the same. They are not changed. Only 2 external entities again. And now one itself is taken into 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. 2 is taken into 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, and so on. And similarly 4, 2 and 3 and 4. Okay, and one could in fact go beyond this and make it from 3.1 to 3.1.1, 3.2.2 and so on. Even I would not recommend that, for a simple reason that unless it is a very, very complex problem, that is, you are going to end up with a million line code or something like that, which is true in certain live processes. What they would probably do is that the top level process itself will be separated out into many top level processes, and each one can be expanded. So if you go too much to the grain, as I said, grain size becomes too small, then it is not very effective. So there should be a reasonable grain size. My suggestion is to keep it up to about 2 levels to 3 levels in this case, top level, middle level, and the lowest level. That is exactly what I did in my example. So let me go back and look at what all we did earlier in terms of the we started with this mess management system, okay, which is a top level DFD, okay, which is what I have given in that picture. And then from this we went to the next level, 2 and now 1 was there in the earlier one, and then because 1, 2, 3 cannot be shown in one, I have shown 1 and 2 and 3 in the other. And from that I went to 1.2, 1.2, 1. Now I broke up 1 into multiple parts, and then I broke up 2 into multiple parts. Okay, so effectively I have shown the leveling as an example. Okay, so this is essentially what is the specific case for this general case. In other words, I started out with an example. I went to a general set of rules. I went back and showed you how I had done it. So it's not any magic. Leveling is a fairly straightforward thing, and it only promotes certain amount of logical thinking and divide and conquer, dividing a large problem into smaller problems. Okay. Now let us go back and look at some of the illegal constructs in DFDs. No loops are allowed in DFD. What I mean by no loops are allowed in DFD, one output cannot start from a particular circle or a process, go to another process and return back. So that will essentially be can become an endless loop. And so endless loops, as you know, have no cure. The machine will stop. So there is shouldn't be any loops. A process cannot be a pure decision, because a process has got to do a number of things. Normally I say it is not a single instruction. If you have a pure decision, it's a single instruction. Okay, so single instruction has no meaning. For instance, a single data flow should not be split up into many flows with different labels. Okay, like output, you can say here is actual rate greater than standard rate, actual rate less than equal to, and also the compare is single comparison instruction. The comparison instruction is a single one, which is not a, it's a single instruction, which again is not really a process. So no data flow can be allowed between stores, because stores are both dumb stores. Stores only store data. So if you cannot transfer from one to the other without any processing, because there is no point in doing it. If you have to do something like that, you might as well merge the two files. Okay. And this is a illegal construct. There is a loop. Record is taken, calculate bill, and ask for next record. And then you may end up with a situation where next record is not there, it will hang up, or there is no proper thing you have put for the end of records, and it may hang up. So this is a bad construct. We have been looking at so far what are known as logical DFDs. See, what I mean by logical DFD is that we have really looked at the logic of the system in terms of what logical data flow, how the logical data are processed, how files are created, how the logical data is taken from the input entity and processed results into the output entities. And so primarily it is more or less to do with logic rather than physical documents. Normally when you work with a user, the user is a lot more comfortable with a physical system. In other words, he will tell you who generates what document, from whom to whom does it go, what does he do with the document, and what document does he generate, to whom does he send. See, the documents need not entirely be logical documents. There could be actually physical documents. So a physical DFD is similar to a document flow diagram, but it specifies who does these operations, and the operations are specified by the logical DFD. In other words, physical DFD tells who does what. In other words, let me take an example that will become clearer. Physical DFD depicts physical movement of goods. Physical DFD can be drawn during fact gathering phase. Because I said, fact gathering phase, the users are a lot more comfortable with documents flowing and things like that. Okay. Particularly if you are going to a novice, in other words, if you are going to a new hotel and trying to kind of computerize a new hotel management system, then they will only tell you about what are the existing methods of taking the a document from a customer who comes, and a document which is a bill which is created, a payment he makes, and so on and so forth. Okay. So it's a physical thing. Let me give an example, a daily example. In fact, before bank computerization, if you remember, maybe you don't remember, because of course still now many banks which are in rural areas or areas which are not computerized, not banks which are not computerized, normally small banks, which still use this technique. In other words, a customer goes to what is known as a clerk or a teller. Okay, and nowadays the term teller is used to a clerk who gives the cash immediately, but I am essentially telling a receiving clerk, and a check is given by the customer to the clerk, and the clerk checks whether the check is valid, signature is valid, and is there a balance in the check, and if there's balance account to pay the check, and whether any mistakes have been made in the entry of that check. In other words, if you have entered the wrong date, okay, or you made some corrections, then they will always tell you immediately to kind of change the date and put your signature again. Okay. So this physical part, even today, if you go and give a check, because you have to give a physical check, except in ATMs, you have to give a physical check, and the physical check is actually checked by the clerk there, except that the ledger is not used, but a computer is used to look at the ledger, which is stored in the computer, and signature is also stored in the computer. So signature which is there is been scanned and stored. So the scanned signature and this signature are actually visually compared. Most often it is visually compared. It is not automatically compared, because the automatic comparison methods are not still very mature. I mean, of course they are coming, and maybe in a few years you can just give a check and it will be taken by a machine, and everything will be checked there, even handwritten part, and then check your signature and so on. Fortunately, that date has not come, because we still need people to kind of do all these things. Okay. So verify the signature balance, and of course customer accounts file is available to the clerk, and if it is a bad check, the bad check is returned for either correction or saying that you don't have any balance, so check cannot be honored. If the check is okay, then a token is issued, so that you can use the token to go to the cashier and take your money from the cashier. Now the cashier also be told that this check has been validated and I have given a token number. So what that clerk will do is write on that check the token number also, and sign there, or get this manager's signature. Some places if the amount is too large, it has got to be verified by a manager, and manager also verifies it, and then he puts a signature, and then it goes to the cashier. Now in the meanwhile, of course, the customer is waiting for his cash, because this process, which could be a manual process, takes a few minutes. If it is a good bank, it may be over in 5 minutes, but if it is not such a good bank, or the rush is too much, first of the month or something like that, then it will take longer, because there will be queues will be built up, and the clerk only can do at a certain rate. Okay. So in any case, the token, the whole idea of a token is that you know when to kind of present the token to the cashier, and normally in most banks there is a display device on top, and when your token is ready, she will press a button and your token number will appear in the display device. Okay. And then you go to the cashier, present your present your token and get cash, and the cashier has to in turn store those checks, physical checks, because later on it may be required for verification. An entry in the day book. What is meant by a day book is, if there is issued cash, she has to immediately update her cash balance, because at the end of the day she is answerable, or he is answerable to how much of money was drawn by her and how much of money being returned, and so they will reconcile how much of money was given out to customers, and they have to reconcile the fact that this money was taken, this money was given, this balance is so much. So that is facilitated by a entry book. It's called a entry book in terms of the thing. So this is the kind of thing which you will, when you go and try to computerize a bank for the first time, the physical DFD is the one which the manager of the bank or any clerk will be comfortable with. Okay. And you also understand the process of what goes on. Of course, this is a very simple process, but even that has got couple of steps. Okay. But it is also shows the importance of the documents. Documents are not, we talk about paperless office, paperless systems and so on. All said and done, papers still play a very important role, like your checkbook. Your check is a paper, and that has got an important role to play. And the physical checks are stored again, because suppose you issued a self check and later on you dispute that self check was drawn by somebody for whom it was not intended, then they should go back and be able to retrieve your check and then see who has drawn the money on your behalf, and tell the customer that somebody else has taken it, or maybe you have made a mistake or whatever, and not or it's a forgery, in which case a complaint has got to be lodged. So the point I am trying to make is, you cannot get rid of also the paper documents, and very often the stored checks are kept stored for a few months. I mean, normally in banks they have some kind of a time limit saying that beyond 3 months or so they will destroy all the checks. So if you don't go back and check your balances and find some check which is issued was not issued by you, after 3 months they will say it's too late. I mean, you have to come within a certain period. 3 months itself is a very long time. Okay, and in fact some banks, modern banks, newer banks, they don't allow for more than a month. I mean, because storing all this paper takes up storage space, and if it is a bank in a central business locality, rentals are very high, and you have to store in a storeroom somewhere there. Okay, normally they will send it out to an archive, but then if somebody comes and asks, of course he cannot reply immediately. It's got to be taken out from the archives and brought back and so on. So the point, because the points I really want to make is that the paper documents are important, their flow is important, and because of the fact that paper documents are important and flows are important and storage documents are important, document flow diagram is also important. It is not something which you can ignore. Okay, and given this document flow diagram, then you go to the logical DFT of same thing, except now I am going to look at what processes will be used in a computerized bank to be able to do the same thing. Okay, so the computerized bank, the customer presents the check, so it retrieves the customer record from the customer account, and then it is and then balance is checked and a token is issued. Again, if it is a teller system, instead of token issues, the line will go from check balance issue to cash to the customer. And many banks now have a teller up to a certain limit. That is, you could probably go to a teller and get up to about 2,000 rupees or so right away without any further edo. Whereas if it is a check, even in a computerized bank, check about 20,000 rupees, something like that, then of course naturally they will not give you immediate cash. Teller will not give, because teller cannot take the responsibility. So a token will be issued, and the teller will store the token number and check, and also the search and in other words, I am breaking up the cashier's thing again. There is the store and token number and check is the check either can be stored as a physical storage, or also in some computerized banks what they will try to do is to of course before you pay cash, that token has got to be stored in a physical storage, but after the cash is paid, as I said, the documents occupy too much space and you can't keep it for too long. Some branches are now what they are trying to do is to scan the check, and they put the scanned document in the database, so that, as I said, the complaint about 3 months later somebody comes, then you can easily retrieve it. The paper documents retrieve, there will be a big bundle and they got to take out one by one and so on. It will take a long time, whereas retrieval from a computer is reasonably fast. So, if there is a particular bank which has got a huge number of transactions with checks and so on, they would put a scanner, because actually the scanner, the reason why they may not put a scanner everywhere is it occupies space, it costs money, and it may not be worth scanning, but some places they do it offline. In other words, they store it for the whole day. At the end of the day, they will take all those things offline, scan it and store it. Okay. So, these are the kinds of things which you essentially, as a systems analyst, you have to tell the bank person. That is, we have got too many transactions, maybe you should not scan it online, should actually scan it offline, but store a physical check with token number, in which of course can be stored in the file in the computer also. Okay. And then the search and match token. The search and match token is again physical, normally it is physically done. Okay. You could also do logically, in the sense that if the token itself is a number entered in a computer, token number, and the token number is the one which travels, and the token number comes to the search and match, and then that displays automatically. Okay. That also can be made somewhat automatic. Okay. That is the reason I have shown it this way. And but in this case, the token slip is given to the for matching, okay, against what is what comes from the check, and check with the token goes to the update daily book, and the day book essentially, as I said, is the important part to be able to find out how much cash is assured on any given day. So, the point is that once you start with a physical DFD, then you can look at the logical processes which are involved, and these logical processes probably will make more sense to you. And then you can once the logical process makes sense to you, then you can go back and maybe based on this suggest some methods of doing things, doing business, or better computerization to the company for which you are doing it. In this case, I took a very simple example of a bank. The same thing I could try for, say, a hotel management system or something like that, where you look at maybe you can go to a hotel and find out what do they do physically, okay, and then you can essentially see how it can be done logically. Okay. That gives you an example of this. So, this module is kind of was concerned with data flow diagrams. The major issues or the major points we covered was that data flow diagrams are an important tool in analyzing systems, and you start, certain rules are there in terms of how to create data flow diagrams. Data flow diagrams is actually a graphical aid. The graphical aid, the components consist of the processes, files, external entities, data flows, data input flows, output flows, and so on. Okay, and these are all how they are all interconnected. And then we looked at the how to start with the top level data flow diagram, and then we went to kind of breaking it up or leveling, and we looked at some of the leveling rules, and also we looked at some of the rules which you should follow in creating the DFD. In other words, DFD itself, you know, at the end of making a DFD, to check whether you have made any mistakes or not, you go back and look at the rules. Okay, and if you have logically done the work, those rules are you would have automatically followed. But sometimes you are careless, and then something will be there, which like a loop between two processes. Then you can recognize that and immediately remove it. In fact, some of these things there are also tools available. Tools are available for doing number of things. Tools are available for drawing the data flow diagram, because drawing, of course, consists of a nice looking drawing. If you want to draw, of course, you can use the drawing tool in the in the PC itself. Okay, but DFD drawing tools are there which give you the label and labeling and so on. Leveling itself, of course, is something a little bit more, what I would say, human. Automatic leveling will not be done by any computerized program, but the checking of incorrect DFDs like loops, like two files being connected, all those can be detected by a computer program. So, there are computer programs available to detect errors, to kind of help you draw, help you kind of store the thing, okay, so that you can retrieve it. And if you got multiple levels, you can also show a larger diagram, print it out and show a larger diagram, but nobody likes a very large diagram. You really have to kind of always start with the top level and then go to the smaller levels, and each one by one you can show. Okay. So, these are all some tools which are there, and some tools are there in the open domain, but as you know, open domain tools normally give you a 1 month license or something like that, and then it expires. But in any case, we want to learn, you can always go to the open domain tools and look through that and see what it does. Okay. And at least when you go and work for a company later on who have got professional tools, you would not be completely unaware of the existence of tools. Okay. So, that is the reason why you should always look at open domain software, particularly as a student, because most colleges cannot afford to buy some of these very expensive tools. Okay. And so, open domain, of course, as I said, for 1 month free trial will be there, and you can try it out, and you will not take more than a month to try out some DFDs and so on. So, you can try it out for a few days, and then of course, if it expires, it expires. Okay. And that is what I would suggest. Okay. In the web part of this course, there is web support material. We are given some site names and so on for your convenience. So, some URLs are being given. So, you can look at those URLs for some of the tools. Okay. And so, you can play around with that URL. See, the whole complaint about our education is that it is impractical. In other words, we only talk about theory, we do not do any practice. So, that is the reason why the practice part, unless you know how to use tools yourself, the practice part cannot be taught in a lecture. See, it can be taught to some extent in a lab. Okay. But even in a lab, I think things like these and searching for a particular URL for data flow diagram and so on is it's anybody with a reasonable common sense, and a Google search can do these things. Okay. So, what I would suggest is that in most of the things I am going to talk about later on also, apart from the what I say in the lecture, there are also support material in the web which I have created. Apart from that, also there are URLs, Google search you can do and get a lot of information. In fact, sometimes you would call it information overkill. The whole idea of my putting a set of transparencies in the web support material for this course is that without having to go through a ocean of information, you can find concisely. And also each module I have given the URLs which are relevant for that module. And I also given a comparison of other books where you can read this and what books give you a reasonable treatment of this. Okay. So, in other words, the textbook is important to have, but along with the textbook you also can look at some reference books. Okay. And this is the whole idea of combining lectures and also some web support material to go along with the lectures. Okay. And so, this module is now over, and I will start with the next module, which is on process specification. Okay. The process specification is primarily what goes into each of those circles in the DFD. Okay. Said each of the circles is actually a process. So, how to clearly enunciate the specification? Specification can be written down in plain sentences or a page, but that does not make much sense. Okay. That is what will be given by the manager to you before you computerize. So, you have to convert that word statement or say half a page of description into a process. Okay. So, the structured English is what I am going to use for process specification, and there are certain types of business rules, as they call it, which are very complex business rules, where there are a whole lot of if and if conditions and then else and so on, and they can become very confusing in a structured English thing. Okay. Whereas in a decision table they get concise, and in a tabular structure, just like in a truth table, you are able to see at a glance what conditions are applied, what rules apply, what actions you have to take. Okay. So, these are two major ones I am going to be talking about in the this module. So, also when you come up with a process specification, you must be sure the specification is not incomplete. Completely, whatever is given in the write up, that has been followed and nothing has been left out, and there is no ambiguity. Sometimes written English will have some contradictory specifications, and those have got to be checked before it goes to a computer. Ambiguity, see, because human language unfortunately is not completely unambiguous. If the human language is unambiguous and you can interpret it only one particular way, then there won't be any lawyers at all. Okay. So, human languages are by nature certain amount of ambiguities, but the ambiguities have got to be cleared, but no ambiguity can occur in the process specification. Okay. And contradictions, any contradictory requirements which are put there, which you should be able to detect and tell the manager this contradictory requirements. If I do one, I can't do the other. Okay. Redundancy, unnecessary rules are given. The rules can be much more concise, because what happens in real practice is, particularly things like insurance rules and many other rules, in fact even government service rules and so on, those rules are all initiated, and then they find out some problem in actually implementing it, and then they add more rules without really seeing whether the new rules are contradictory to the older rules, are ambiguous and so on. Okay. And so, new rules go on building up, and you got a very complex set of business rules which have all these difficulties, and even then it can be incomplete because in a specific case, and it could happen that because you went on adding as an afterthought, you could have put certain same rules again because you didn't remember that rule already existed. So, this has got to be done automatically to some extent. The tool you use should be able to check this also. So, in decision table specification, it is reasonably easy to do the checking of incompleteness, ambiguity, contradictions and redundancy, whereas it is not all that easy in a structured English statement. So, the basic rule is to use decision tables whenever you have a whole set of complex rules, and use the structured English when you have a lot of loops. I mean, you have something like make a programming like constructs, do while or repeat until and things like that. Okay. In which case the specification in English is much neater. Eliminating redundant specifications, and there is also something called decision tree, which is a descendant of the decision table, and we will find out later on that in decision table there is certain strict order. There is no strict order in following conditions. Otherwise, conditions in a table can be carried out in any order, any random order, whereas in decision tree will be one where the conditions have got to be tested in a specific order. So, a tree is something like you all know about tree structure except that the nodes of these trees are decisions, the arrows are actions, and so it again shows at a glance a tree starting with a certain set of decisions and how those decisions got broken up into further decisions and how ultimately actions are taken. I will give an example as I go along. How to use structured English precisely to specify processes, terminology used in decision tables, and how to detect errors, decision trees, comparison of structured English, decision tables and decision tree. Because I am giving 3 different tools, I should compare all the 3 tools, and that is what I will do at the end. So, before designing systems, see, the main motivation is that must clearly understand the logic. I already said that, and for each process block of the DFT has got to be expanded, and its understanding must be cross checked with the user as information system. A notation is thus needed to specify process blocks. Notation used must be appropriate for the type of application model. Different notations are needed to represent repetition structures, complex decision situation, and situations where sequencing of testing of conditions is important. That is why there are 3 different kind of tools. For, as I said, for complex decision processes, then and to detect logical errors and so on, a tabular structure is useful. Okay. And let us start with the actual process specification. Once a DFT is obtained, the next step is to precisely specify the process and either structured English, decision tables or decision trees. Again, I am saying the same thing. Decision tables are used when the process is logically complex, and trees are used when conditions must follow a certain strict order. Structured English is similar to programming language like Pascal. In fact, it is closer to Pascal than to C, because C is too concise. Okay, and it does not have, however, strict syntax and semantic rules. In other words, there is no comma, full stop, which has got to be compulsory. Like, in any programming language, it has been interpreted by a computer. It is very important to have the proper commas, full stops, dashes, dots, and so on at the right place. Okay, if you don't have it, then it's a syntax error. Okay, so there doesn't have any syntax rules. So because it does not have any syntax rules, it cannot be automatically checked by a computer. It has got to be converted to a program, and that program can be checked by a computer. But at the time you create the process specification in structured English, you can also create what test data can be used later on when you write the program. Okay, so that will be easy to write this. Structured English, the intention is to give precise description of a process. A structured English description should be understandable to the user. Okay, you have to give a precise description, and it should be usable. I'll very quickly give an example. If customer pays advance, then give 5% discount. Else, if purchase amount is greater than 10,000, then if customer is a regular customer, then give 5% discount. Else, no discount. And so there is a whole lot of nested ifs and else. And the whole point is that it shows that it gives a set of rules for giving discounts when a customer buys something from you. So based on the purchase order and so on, you do that. So next time I will look at this in greater detail and explain this, and I will essentially stop at this point and continue in the next lecture.